Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a PhD student at the University of Oxford in the Department of Politics and International Relations. Dominic Johnson, who spoke earlier today, is my supervisor. And I was inspired to do a lightning talk for today based on this quote by the NIMBioS Evolution and Warfare Workshop proposal. And basically what it's saying is social interactions are complex, warfare is complex, and applying mathematical modeling may help us understand why you see all these complexities and why you see conflict and cooperation in societies. So firstly, my research question is, why do some states experience recurrent conflict and why do other states not experience recurrent conflict? And within the literature, recurrent conflict means that you have episodes of armed conflict with periods of peace. And a lot of databases separate periods of peace can be anything from 5 years to a year. So you'll have an interval of peace will be like no armed conflict. So this is what's in the literature, and the theoretical literature is known as negative peace. And recurrent conflict begins again, and it's called recurrent, not persistent conflict, because the conflict is fighting over the same grievances with the same belligerents or warring parties. In contrast, persistent conflict is many years of conflict without interruptions of peace. And these interruptions of peace can be ceasefire, stalemate, peace agreements, things like this. And the motivation for studying recurrent conflict is more than ever, especially after the Cold War ended in 1989. Interstate conflict is more frequent and lasts longer. And as we can see from Southwest United States to Southeast Asia, interstate conflict has detrimental effects for neighboring states, and not only neighboring states, but also regionally and globally. And there's not one or a few variables that can explain recurrent conflict. I'm into this idea that there's several variables that are important, and they're all interacting. And these variables are interacting and are creating emergent behavior. So I'm looking at conflict as a complex system. And also, I'm arguing against this idea of conflict traps. Within the literature, conflict traps is a cycle of conflict based on usually poverty and a history of conflict within a state, and that state is at equilibrium, and it's hard to push that conflict state out of equilibrium because it's in such a strong attractor state. I'm arguing instead of being in a state of equilibrium, it's also in a state, it's otherwise in a state of unstable equilibrium and not stable equilibrium. So within international relations and political sciences, there's two ways to try to understand recurrent conflict quantitatively. One is through statistical tests, and this is done either usually through time series analysis or multiple regression, or looking at classical game theory. And what classical game theory does is you examine a conflict situation and you find that there's an equilibrium. But it doesn't tell you whether or not this equilibrium is stable or unstable. It just says you've reached equilibrium. And I'm arguing recurrent conflict is a consequence of multiple unstable equilibria based on complexity theory framework. So my contribution for my research is looking at conflict through a complexity lens rather than a rationalist approach. And rationalism is much more dominant within political science than IR. And also applying a dynamic model from ecology theory and empirical studies rather than looking at more static models such as classical game theory or regression analyses. So my main influence within the biological sciences is within ecology theory from a mathematical standpoint. It argues for competitive exclusion. So the number of species that can survive is equal to the number of resources that are available, and this allows the species to settle at equilibrium. However, within empirical research, within different ecosystems, species can coexist on a limited number of resources because they are not at equilibrium, and that's what I'm arguing is what's going on in recurrent conflict. As you have multiple warring parties that are fighting. It can be over resources, or it could be like they have different strategy selection, which is different from a game theory approach, but I can get into that after the talk if you like. And the reason why it's so difficult and so unpredictable is that they are fighting in this unstable equilibrium point. And so within these ecological systems that are not at equilibrium, because there's multiple species fighting over a limited number of resources, these species are oscillating in population abundance. And competitive effects do not allow for one species to dominate. So all species aren't coexisting at the same time. So there's population ebbs and flows, and you have different species that are dominating at one point in time, then decreasing in abundance, and then dominating again, and then multiple species are doing kind of like similar intervals in population abundance. Okay, this is my last slide. And then, so my big, I guess, hypothesis is recurrent conflict is recurrent because it fails to settle at equilibrium. That is, dynamics within a system experiencing recurrent conflict as a consequence of that system cycling near unstable equilibria. And